Okay, I think we're going to start. Apologies for the confusion with the room and slight late start, but that's, yeah.
We'll survive.
Okay, so just to introduce Mr. Brett Scott, who is an economic explorer. I would consider a modern-day philosopher, somebody who spends his time thinking and writing about alternative finance and also thinking about cryptocurrency. And he's going to share today some of his thoughts on the space. He does a lot of public speaking on the topic, and it'll also be an opportunity for you to ask any questions as well, kind of like we did yesterday with James and Nectarios. So I'll hand over to Brett. Thank you very much.
Cool. How's it? I haven't been doing many talks recently, actually. I've been writing a book, which has been quite nice. I've just been like chilling at home. Normally I'm constantly on the road. So yeah, this is going to be my first talk for a while. And I don't actually know entirely what... Sam gave me like quite a wide brief, which was like sort of talk about cryptocurrency, but also like about everything else in the alternative finance space, which is a huge area of different things. Something's with the camera. So yeah, I'm going to try and start with just like maybe a general overview of contextualizing alternative economy. I don't know if you guys have done this already, or like, but like, and then so you could sort of see where the alternative finance space fits within it. And then like crypto is like one sort of like subcategory within the alternative finance space. Like it's but one thing. I wrote this book, like it came out 2013, so that's around, but I got another book coming out next year about cash, physical cash, and digital money, and financial technology, and financial automation more generally. And so yeah, that's me. Okay. I do lots of different things. Like I'm not actually, Sam sort of said, I think about these things, like to some extent I think about them, but I also do actually work on some projects occasionally. So these are like various groups that I work with, and one of the things that's like, I actually used to work in the financial sector in derivatives, which is like a sort of kind of like overhyped part of finance people often talk about. It's really not that complicated. It's just large bets that financial institutions place on things. Actually, a lot of more boring finance is actually far more profound and important than the sort of high-level abstract finance that people fixate upon a lot of the time. Anyway, I have a background in that, but I work with a lot of different groups, from like small charities through to like big organizations and stuff, and little alternative currencies and like all sorts of things. And in this process, I get to sort of see different conceptions people have of what they think is wrong in the global economy, and also like what you would do about it. So there's like different layers in the sort of alternative economy space. There's like a description of what the problem is. That's like one layer, and people have got a whole bunch of different descriptions. And then like, if you can agree on a description, then maybe you can decide what you want to have instead. But people have a whole bunch of different ideas what they want, and then they've got a whole bunch of different ideas of how you would get to that place you want to get to. So trying to coordinate alternative economy movements is like quite nightmarish, because there's so much overlapping and like vague, like misunderstandings, and it's like, so you try to hang out with like mainstream sustainable finance people. I mean, Sam, you must have experienced this kind of thing. Like, you've got a particular notion of how you're going to solve climate change stuff, and you've got like hardcore eco-anarchists who are like got a very different notion of how it's going to work, even though they've got vaguely similar goals. So it's quite interesting to sort of spend time with these different groups and see how they conceptualize this stuff. Anyway, I just thought I would try and use a corporate structure. I haven't done this talk for a while, so I'm just as the slides come up, I'm going to see what they are, and then I have to respond to them. I have a picture of a corporation here. This is a very crude picture of a corporation. a single corporation in a capitalist economy. And basically the deal is, these guys here, this is the financial sector in a very broad brush strokes, essentially kickstarts some legal entity, which is that thing in the middle, with money tokens. All right, we can discuss monetary systems, and that entity gets empowered then to blast that out to a bunch of other players. It will spend that money on suppliers, assets, workers, managers. It will activate stuff in the world. It'll spend money. Like WeWork would have started by getting money from a bunch of investors, and they use it to rent this place here. So that's like suppliers or something. Well, you can characterize it however you want. And then they'll produce something which they will output into a market. And, well, let me go back here. The reason why I have this, actually, I realized because of the next slide, is that at each stage in this process, you have different problems that emerge and different types of movements to try to address those particular problems. So, for example, at this production phase here, there's a whole bunch of things that people think about. Okay, so one of the classic ones you'll see in sustainability circles is like externalities. In the process of producing the thing that you're going to make output into a market, you wreck a bunch of stuff. You know, you pollute things, you do all number of like destructive things can happen. All right. You can also exploit your workers in the process of getting them to mobilize your assets and do the production. So, for example, here in WeWork, I don't know how well the workers are treated. All right. So there could be some big environmental impact of this space, plus people could be getting screwed over or not, depending on how it's run. Okay, I have no idea. I don't really have any idea who's doing what in the space. But this is the politics of production. All right. And also in that sort of supplier section, suppliers are kind of like labor pools you're kind of plugging into your own system. All right. So people are doing other production, plugging it into this space here. And so, for example, like your iPhone, which is technically produced by Apple, it's not really produced by Apple, it's produced by gigantic global supply chains, which starts with people literally like doing artisan mining of coltan out of like mines in Central Africa. All right. Apple is just like the final layer on top of that, right? They just happen to just like assemble it and then distribute it to people. So behind all these things, these gigantic chains of labor and so on, and there's a lot of activism around all these spaces around trying to raise awareness about this. Okay, so that's that sort of production layer. Then you output it into markets where people will pay money for these things, all right? And in this space, you get a whole bunch of stuff. So people on markets being abused in various ways. So customers getting screwed over. This is slightly different to workers getting screwed over. All right, so there's a lot of stuff about scandals about customers being, you know, sold crap products or being sold things without being told what's actually happening in those things. And there's a more general philosophical question about a general culture of consumerism where people become kind of dazed drones who just sort of buy stuff without having any real joy that they get from it. Okay, which is quite well known to most people. And then once this process happens, so you have the kickstarting, and so these lines I'm drawing here are trying to show monetary flows. You sort of like saw money coming in, activating the assets and getting the workers to do that, outputting onto a market, and then the money that flows back goes initially out to creditors. You'll see this on any balance sheet that you look on, like if you look through how money flows through a corporation. The revenues go back and that get outputted to people who've lent money, all right, and then they get outputted to the government in the form of taxes. That's the next thing that happens. And then this space is a whole bunch of stuff, right? So this is like the intersection between the state and the economy and corporations. And there's a bunch of stuff, a bunch of politics at that particular point there, because on the one hand, there's a whole bunch of stuff around corporate tax avoidance, you know, sort of companies screwing states over. But there's also a whole bunch of stuff about states being complicit with companies and exploitative behavior. For example, I'm from South Africa. The apartheid state used to actively help companies get access to cheap pools of labor, all right, and would break labor pools in order to enable corporate domination. All right, so like there's a whole bunch of politics in this intersection between states and the corporate sector. And then finally, once you paid the government on their tax, it can be outputted to shareholders, which is the very last point in any kind of corporate balance sheet you see, is that's what they call the bottom line, right? Boom, it's your final people who extract money from this circuit. Is that kind of like relatively clear for you guys? Okay. And you can start to see that there's at all these different points, there's sort of like intervention points you can try to like do, or like try to like mess with, or like things you can try to alter. And most of the alternative economy movements will be trying to sort of target one or more of those things. It's often hard to target more than one because this is a huge task. And this is but a single corporation. Bear in mind they all lock into each other in a big like a modular formation. And the way they lock into each other is through that supplier chain there, right? A lot of corporations are suppliers to each other. So like a large steel or a large sort of iron ore manufacturer plugs into a steel manufacturer, which plugs into an automotive manufacturer, and they form these big chains that like span the globe. And us ordinary sods kind of get the final point of that, which is the actual like things that sort of emerge on supermarket shelves after many years of like actual all the sort of chains being built up. So if you're ever trying to dislodge the power of the corporate sector, it's quite a big job, and it's going to take quite a while. Sam, are you trying to do that with interdependence, for example? Okay, and this is a very crude picture of a corporation. An actual corporation is more like this, right? This is BP. This is a project that I worked on with a group called Open Oil, where we mapped out the corporate structure of BP, a single corporation in the constellation of corporations. BP itself, so that little like that yellow section in the middle there, I put as a single thing. It's not a single thing. BP owns 1,200 subsidiaries around the world. It's a constellation of 1,200 companies, all like latched together via financial contracts. And this thing here actually is where you input money from like, investors in London, input via the main mothership company, which then gets blasted out to this whole network of 1,200 companies across the globe. And then they all have all their own contracts, which are slowly extracting back, and eventually gets outputted back out of London again in the stock market. All right, so these are huge constellations, and they're all like locking together, which is interesting. And then on the financial side, so let me just backtrack. On that section there, there's the creditors, shareholders side. There's a whole bunch of like players around there, which are all about sort of kickstarting these money flows. But those are also giant corporations that are doing that, right? So like Goldman Sachs, for example, this is a diagram of their corporate structure, which is done through open corporates. And basically what's happened here is we changed the size of countries depending on how many subsidiaries are present from that company. And if you can see this giant sort of continent that's down here for Goldman Sachs, that's the Cayman Islands. Okay, so in the world of Goldman Sachs, Cayman Islands is like a huge entity, right? And there's that line you see there is a single strand in its corporate structure. So you can see it. There's an American company to another American company to a Cayman Islands company to an American company to a Luxembourg company to a Cayman Islands company. And you can create these whole chains of these things all through the world, and that's but one strand. Okay, and these are how most corporations are operating, and this is then plugging into stuff like BP. Okay, so you have these.
Right. Can I ask what program did you use to create?
I didn't actually create that. We did the BP one, which also we use Open Corporate's backend to do this. They've got some kind of like.
Right. So Open Corporate is an open source website that has information about.
Open Corporates is an open data project trying to create transparency around corporations. There's a whole scene of like the open data movement, which is about how do you take organizations that traditionally are very opaque and try to shine light on them. Okay. Open Corporates is one of them. It's based at the ODI, which is the Open Data Institute in London. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of these. There's also various groups that are trying to raise awareness and raise transparency around how this process works. This is one of them, BankTrack. I can show you many more, but they try to sort of trace who's funding what in the global corporate sector. Okay, any immediate questions? You guys right? Okay, cool. Now, one of the immediate things, if you face this system as an ordinary person walking through the streets of London, is you'll see there's a gigantic power differential between you and these systems, right? So, like, they appear vast and alienating, and like, so this here is a picture I took in Commerzbank Tower in Frankfurt from the outside of the tower, and you can see it sort of looms like this huge entity. If you walk through the streets here, you'll see these looming entities everywhere. From the inside of Commerzbank Tower, this is the urinals inside Commerzbank Tower, you look out on the world in this like vast abstract haze. You know, everything is like done at scale and abstraction. Because you're so huge, you can't deal with individual people. They're too like small. So you want your impulse is to sort of like create bureaucratic systems and automate things. Like that's how you deal with the scale and the structure, or how you do huge throughput. So these are all bureaucracies, right? And a lot of people experience themselves as just sort of like passive recipients of things from these bureaucracies, and have this very kind of passive attitude, and often quite patronized by these entities. I'm just going to like throw this slide in here about the kind of like mental state that settles into society when you're in this situation. There's this guy, Mark Fisher, who actually unfortunately died, but who's wrote this concept, or created this concept of capitalist realism. This is my own version of it here. When you're like born into this gigantic global structure, you're totally immersed in it. You're totally dependent upon it, and most people cannot practically imagine how they would change it. All right, it's too vast. I mean, in this room here, we could imagine, for example, doing interventions. Like maybe if you guys got irritated by me, you'd all like jump up and just like tell me to shut up and throw me out, or you'd do something. We could make interventions quite easily in this space. All right, and collectively make decisions. But imagine now there were like 5 million of us. Imagine being at the vast conference of 5 million people. Like suddenly everything gets so much harder to try and coordinate stuff. It's extremely difficult. And most people can't conceptualize how, when you're immersed in these gigantic systems, how you'd ever have any individual agency do anything. All right, so you can't push pause on these systems, whereas in this room we could push pause. Like Sam could say, "Shut up, Brett. Let's stop for a moment and let's like recalibrate." We can't do that with the global economy. Like, we would need to be able to push pause for like at least a week. So we could try and like think about how to like rearrange stuff. Even single companies can't do this. Like you go into a big corporation, they struggle intensely to try and rearrange their internal systems. Even that's within a single company. All right, and then the sort of scale and interdependence elements of the trying to even understand the connections in the system is so huge. So even if you could kind of push pause, you'd be like, okay, let's try and figure out what's going on. Like, there's so many interconnections, it would be so hard to do it. And then, like, even if you could figure it out, you got this, like, massive consensus problem where, like, well, what do we want to change? Right? You'd have to get everyone on board, and there'd be a whole bunch of vested interests, people who are like, actually, no, we don't want that to change. Right now you got this with the oil industry. We got like a vague sense of the problem, but the oil industry will keep on lobbying against, and sort of it'll stop. It won't allow consensus on this issue. And even if you could get the consensus, then you've got this giant coordination problem of how do you get everyone to act at the same time to then rearrange something, right? So a lot of people who engage in like alternative economy start to like, there's a lot of like angst about what's realistic to expect, all right? So like this notion of being realistic, just like one of the notions like what's likely to happen. I mean, like, well, what's likely to happen in our current economic system is we're likely to sort of crash, all right? That's what's likely to happen if you're being cold about it. That's what any kind of sober trajectory looks like, okay? But then what you can sort of pragmatically imagine doing, like what realistically can you do about that? Like most people have got these kind of like, are constrained by what the existing infrastructure is, their existing imagination, what their capabilities are, constrained by their ideological interests. A lot of people don't want to act against their own interests. You know, a lot of people realize, oh, I probably need to reduce my consumption, but they don't. All right, they sort of intellectually understand it, but won't act against it. And then a lot of sort of status quo stuff, which is just like just let the system run. You know, so this is a big problem, and actually for a lot of people, this is what let's get this phrase. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? Like it's just easier to be like. It's more likely that a dystopian cyberpunk science fiction scenario emerges than it is to actually change something, right? And this is why sort of ecological collapse and kind of like cyberpunk, this is like a science fiction genre, dystopias loom so like large in the imagination of people. It's just like, this doesn't seem particularly unlikely, you know? Giant corporations that control a ecologically ravaged world. Okay. Think Blade Runner and all these kind of like things. This is where this imagination comes from. And I guess the question is then, what do you kind of try to do about that? Historically, a lot of people try to use the political system as a bunch of approaches. So many people have this idea that you can kind of like break down the problem into small parts and then sort of try to solve them modularly. So like try to do like bite-sized pieces of the problem, and then hope that the rest of the system doesn't adapt and co-opt your change. So like you imagine all those moving parts held constant, and you're like, I'm going to change this little part, and then I'll hope those things don't change to like fuck up my change, you know, like which is often in a lot of sort of reformist movements. There's like, you know, if you go into mainstream policy circles, they're all like, okay, we're going to make this little change here, and then actually a lot of stuff happens like this. I don't want to diss this because, you know, so incremental improvements in workers' rights, incremental improvements in energy efficiency standards, all these things actually are like incremental little sort of piece-by-piece changes that do occur. But a lot of people get sort of frustrated about, does this ever actually sort of structurally deal with the problem? And a lot of the more sort of like, quote-unquote, revolutionary type approaches are about how do you try and break the entire system at once or rearrange the entire system at once, or break away from that system and create a new one somehow. Interestingly, in a lot of like sort of Sam, you probably already talked about this kind of stuff, but like thinking about how do you maybe create viral change. Some people think, okay, maybe you don't need everybody to change at once. You just need a certain percentage, like 10% or 5% could like trigger off a whole kind of rearrangement of a system. You don't necessarily need to get every single thing at once to change. So a lot of movements, their big hope is, if your hope is to change the overall system, that we just need to get a certain critical mass, and then everything else will follow in a kind of viral type of formation. So I don't know if you guys experience this in your everyday life. I'm just going to flip through that. So these are like different types of movements that kind of like start to buy in, or sort of target different elements of the overall picture. From the fair trade type of movements, trying to target elements of the supply chain, through to like people who try to change the sort of like management structure of companies, so like holacracy and these different styles of management. You get like stuff around trying to change the power dynamics of the workers versus the managers in firms. And you can see all these movements never like target the full picture. They're trying to like do these different little sections of it. And out of this kind of thing comes all these different visions of alternative economy, like different sort of conceptualizations that often come from like a roughly similar impulse. Like there's a roughly similar, a rough sense that there's something wrong with the current configuration, but then like different emphasis or emphases of where you try to change things, where you put stuff. So you get like social economy, you can read all these different types of things. You've probably seen all these different words, and they often overlap with each other and have slightly different genesis points. And some of them are very incompatible with each other. Like degrowth, for example, is like one of the most radical of these type of concepts. So a lot of these other ones don't really endorse degrowth. So like, it means reducing the size of the economy so that you don't use so much. Like, so there's different like, or de-emphasizing the accumulation impulse in favor of a more holistic focus on whatever is not consumption.
Being economical in the traditional sense of the word.
Yeah, yeah. So Yeah, I mean, degrowth could be explained by, like, if you're, let's say you imagine you're in a small-scale island community and you recognize that you're wrecking your underlying ecological base, and you'll get together and you say, tell you what, from now on we're going to try and reduce how much we use and try and let the ecosystem regenerate. That's a degrowth approach, all right? A non-degrowth approach would be like, we're just going to carry on doing the same thing and hope that somehow the island expands. Which is what mainstream policy is. Okay, well, and of course we don't live on a small island. As I said, this is the problem, right? If we did live on a small island, we would be able to get together and have these discussions, but because we live in vast transnational chains of labor that we cannot ever actually communicate or coordinate, the most realistic thing ends up being just keep on doing the same thing. I mean, that's what realism often means in the global economy. Just like don't change anything, just let it run, right? Which is realistic, given that you can't coordinate. So these other broad paradigms. I'm going to go into cryptocurrency now. I realize I'm waffling on about this. Some of these more specific things you can put into broader paradigms where people try to change the entire structure of an economy. You know, Marxists who wanted like global revolution to change everything, versus the more sort of anarchisty movements who say like what we're going to do is we're going to create sort of like little seeds of resistance, and they're going to like virally sort of like germinate around different. We're not going to have central coordination, but it's all going to kind of like at some point be a flourishing or efflorescence of like a new world will emerge. And you got people like the more sort of mainstream political stuff, which is like, okay, we're going to keep the system and make tinker with it, and this is more sort of centricity approaches. And then like you can see all these different ones, yeah. Make capitalism nicer is the dominant approach in most policy kind of stuff. It's like just don't really fundamentally alter anything, just sort of make paper over this stuff kind of thing. And all of these have their own sort of valid elements to it. But the thing that I tend to focus on is this part of the picture here, which is the financial sector, because a lot of what's called alternative economy tends to focus on this section here, or just not that it doesn't focus on finance, but historically a lot of people are happy to talk about co-ops. They're happy to talk about, we should like change the way we sort of think about things. We need to sort of make better consumption choices. But people often have a big resistance to thinking about finance because it often seems quite like particularly complex and particularly dense and strange and alienating for lots of people. So there's a kind of a chronic avoidance of thinking about this part of the picture. And if you think about, there's this distinction between the real economy and finance, which is a bit of like a dubious distinction because these things are all part of a continuum. But this is the distinction with the real economy people imagine is this stuff here. It's like real assets, people buying stuff, producing things. And then finance is like the monetary circuit element of that, sort of the kick-starting of those processes. And if you're thinking about broad paradigms of change, some people think, okay, if you could change the financial sector, everything else would follow. All right, all the other stuff would start to shift around it. Whereas others are like, just like, focus on lobbying corporate managers and stuff like that, and then all the kind of, asset managers and things will just follow suit. And Sam, I'm sure with like ET Index and stuff, you're trying to focus on the shareholders and sort of this investment side, and the hope that it's going to recalibrate all of this stuff on the other side. All right, and that's the part of the philosophy of the alternative finance or financial reform movements. And then within that movement of alternative finance, you get these broad paradigms, which is from more mainstream to less mainstream, which tends to be around. One of them is about, let's imagine, and of course this is a single corporation, let's imagine the whole economy. We imagine what we want, something different. And then we make those aspirational things become more amenable to the needs of the financial sector. So you say, okay, so some social enterprise or some kind of collaborative economy thing needs to make itself more business-like so that financiers respond to it and actually fund it. A lot of mainstream kind of finance things do this. They're like, we want to get the banks to support these community projects and things, but the community projects don't make economic sense to the banks. So like, make the community projects become more economically sensible for the banks. All right? The other side of it is change how the banks think so that they're more likely to actually respond to something that's got a different set of principles. All right, so like change the way that banks work, change their mission structure, change that they actually will organically go and attempt to sort of help out those groups. Does that kind of make sense, that conceptualization? And often there's a kind of like a broad, within all these different movements, they sort of sit in some spectrum along that kind of, or somewhere along that spectrum, from like super far out kind of stuff, which is like we're going to create weird, like flower currencies, and it's going to bring global peace, and that's somehow, through to like very like mainstream things, which are like, the government's going to come in and subsidize solar power so that the banks will then lend money to the solar power plant, stuff like that. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, I could go into all the sort of spectrum of alternative finance, but I am supposed to talk about cryptocurrency today. So I'm going to try and nest cryptocurrency into this broader picture, which I think is useful because lots of crypto people, to put it bluntly, have no idea about the broader picture. Okay, they just sort of fetishize the innovation or the kind of like the tokens floating around, as if somehow they would do something by themselves, all right? Which is often quite frustrating when you go to these events and they sort of very like childishly speak about like what these tokens are going to do. Sorry? Explain?
You said before that most of these people just for the innovation, just about the innovation, no contextualization.
Yeah, what do you mean by diversification though? People are trying to diversify their...
I think you misunderstood what you said.
Oh, okay, sure.
Fred, could I ask a question? Basically, I'm really interested in, is it possible that purely by putting a value on carbon, that could create a very big change in the system? I wonder if you have any views. I'm not sure if this is an area you've thought about in a lot of detail, but I mean, we had a speaker came yesterday and said by valuing carbon, as has been done, with the Kyoto Protocol and things like that, but not globally.
Yeah.
Do you think if you came in and put a global price on carbon, that started low but
Sure,
very rapidly, do you think that would...
Theoretically, yes. The reason why is that essentially, like you're talking about risk-return calculations, stuff like that. A lot of the stuff is based on like risk-return calculations in finance, where they're like, corporations. So you got to first think of corporations as financial conduits. Okay, the financial sector plugs into the corporations. Like the banks and the guys, and then the corporation itself plugs into a bunch of other stuff. So there's these big extractive circuits. But like for these things to make sense, you do these risk-return calculations at every level, all right? Which is how much does something cost to do? How much can we reasonably expect to make back from it? And what risk will we take in the meantime, in the process of doing that? That's in a very crude sense. This is how you do these calculations. Okay. So, for example, if something is not likely to yield very much, but you're going to take a bunch of risk, you're never going to do it. All right. The analogy is like you're not going to embark across a risky Indiana Jones quest across the desert if you only expect to make, find a pair of rusty tins or something like that. But if you expect that you could maybe find the lost ark, then maybe you're prepared to take on this risk because there's a higher risk, higher return. And a lot of financiers are kind of like, they will calibrate themselves somewhere along the spectrum of risk-return. The ultimate uneconomic things are those that have low expected return and higher risk, and normally you require government subsidy for that or charities. That's where they come in, right? They will hit those points where ordinary capitalists will not enter. Now, if you want to try and alter the economic equation, one of the things you can do is try to boost the cost part of it, because you calculate the expected return by saying how much will it probably cost, how much can we expect to make, and then the sort of differential between that's your expected return. So, for example, carbon pricing, you're trying to boost the sort of possible costs. You're trying to internalize the externalities, as I would say. So you're going to increase the cost base which is going to make it less attractive. Actually, say, actually, this is not as attractive as it previously. And one of the reasons why oil companies and all these guys are so profitable historically was they're externalizing all their costs. All right, they're not paying for the actual impact that they're having, which makes them artificially profitable. And as soon as you internalize that, whether it be through a carbon market or through carbon taxation, you can decide on how you implement the internalization process. But in that risk-return calculation, it's going to then make it less attractive. And that's what the carbon tracker, all these groups are trying to figure out arguments for how you do that. Actually, carbon tracker and these guys will often sort of like mess with like the risk stuff. They'll say, actually, this is a lot more risky. There's a whole bunch of, you can play with all these parameters. Like your expected return is much lower than you think it's going to be. It's going to cost you much more. It's much more risky. And as soon as you can mess with that, it destabilizes the whole investment case.
I kind of think about that like now, like right now. I kind of think about that as our magic bullet. If we could get a proper carbon valuation going on, across a big part of the world, then wouldn't the rate at which we're destroying the ecosystem and the planet, whatever, that rate at which we're doing that would drop very dramatically. And very
hypothetically, I mean, it's hypothetically true. Yeah. That's the base. And the devil's in the detail. It's really that, how do you measure these things? How do they get implemented? How do you get political consensus for implementing it across the world? How do you make sure it doesn't there's seepage? I used to work on dabble in carbon stuff, and you'd have these things like somebody says, oh, we're going to sequester carbon in this field here. Then they just means they just go to another field and do the thing that they were going to do there anyway and do it there instead. So they actually end up doing the same thing and then making more money from the carbon credits. And there's a whole bunch of weird stuff that they would do that was actually just defeating the purpose of it. But in a theoretical sense, it is possible. Should I flip into crypto in the last 20 minutes? Okay. Any final questions on? I mean, I could go into any of those things, but
I have one. I just wanted to throw an argument at you that gets thrown at, when you advocate big financial or economic change. The main argument that seems to come back is kind of massive economic impact. You can have an unintended consequence like degrowth, say, as a real extreme example. If you have a huge economic impact to a country like the UK, say, as an unintended consequence of tinkering or whatever, then it always disproportionately affects poor people. So, and that's a huge concern, and people can kind of push away ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see, in your opinion, or maybe you have some good arguments against it, or whatever, but how do you, what's your view on that, basically?
That's a pretty big question. I mean, bear in mind, companies. Let's just go back to that. How do I go back up to? So if you want to understand this historical radical movements, one of the big arguments that was made was that you can see that this is there's a whole sort of circularity element to this. So workers and managers and shareholders are also all customers. These are economic identities. These are slices of people in different situations. So one part of the day you're a worker, or maybe you're a manager, and then you're also a customer at some point, and maybe you're also a shareholder. You could be any number of these identities at once. All right, different people have got different sort of sets. Some people are only workers; they've got nothing else and customers, right? Your most marginalized people historically, we call it the working class, would often be depend upon selling themselves to corporations to earn a little meager wage to be able to buy things from the corporations. That's the circuit. So if you can imagine Tesco, pay your worker a small amount of money, and then they can use the money to buy products from you. Right? That's the circuit there. And then the actual managers of Tesco are extracting via all these other things, and they can go to somewhere that's not Tesco and buy the products. Right? So they can go to the bougie, delicatessen. Right? So there's a lot of you got to look at these full cycles, because a lot of the arguments that are made in economic things are they cut one piece and they sort of superficially say something. And so, for example, it's Tesco's driving prices down. That means this is good for customers because it helps poor people who need cheap goods. It's like, well, why are Tesco's prices down, right? Because they're taking advantage of global supply chains of cheap labor, right, at scale. That's why the prices are down. So from a holistic perspective, Tesco isn't doing anything helpful to people who are on low income, but superficially it looks like that. And so historically the big argument was around what's happening is that people who are doing most of the work in society don't get fully compensated for it, and a certain layer of elites are taking most of it or sort of scraping it off. We're in the middle of the financial sector in London. How is it that individual people in giant banks can make so much money? It's got nothing to do with the amount of labor that they're exerting or energy they're putting into something, right? It's because they're sitting at the apex of the global economy, and below them are millions and millions of much smaller players who are doing all the work. And then you sort of sit in the sort of gatekeeper position at top, which means small changes in this. I guess the analogy is to use like a ship. If you're on a giant cruise liner and you're the captain, tiny little changes of the steering wheel can make enormous impacts. And if you're getting rewarded for those little things, tiny little things equate to £2 million suddenly goes into your account for doing almost nothing, making some tiny little alteration. Okay, and this is what a lot of these sort of hedge fund managers and stuff are all about. You can make so much money because you're sitting on these huge abstracted layers. It's got nothing to do with your actual kind of effort, right? I'm kind of waffling on, but I guess to do it when you're trying to address these arguments people make, jobs will be lost or whatever it is. You got to look at that.
Welfare can't be paid because you shrunk it.
Yeah, but
not enough.
You got to look at the entire circuit. Otherwise, because most of the time these arguments are essentially sliced little partial views, which superficially look like they make sense.
Yeah.
And that takes practice to sort of see when that happens. One of the classic ones is stuff like people will lose jobs if you start doing this. And it's you always notice that when managers come in, they say we will do job creation. We create jobs, but then they deny that they will destroy jobs. So they take one side of it, but they won't do the other side. So they'd be like, oh, without us, we create the jobs, but you destroy the jobs. It's you will destroy them. It's not us. So they kind of have these sort of weird.
Say things like losing a job, it didn't really get lost. Somebody destroyed it.
They threw you out, yeah. And likewise, they will not get rich unless they employ you. All right. The only reason that shareholders can make so much money is that the workers are actually activating the assets to sell to customers. The shareholders themselves don't do anything. All right, so the actual work is always done by these people, right? So in some sense, you cannot become rich unless you have those people doing all the stuff. And this is the whole critique about this whole sort of patronizing picture of workers as these kind of these owners of money and stuff. Well, without them, the workers are screwed. It's without the workers, the shareholders are screwed too. So anyway, I'm hoping this makes sense, but try and think about those full loops. And then you've got to think about it at a global scale as well. So problem in national politics is that you've sliced off a little tiny section of the global economy, and now you want to talk about it as a sort of discrete entity. It's all this stuff here comes from low-paid workers and somewhere else. It's not the UK. All right, so it adds a whole other dimension to this issue. I hope this is inspiring your confidence.
So a lot of the time our language is outdated in the sense that it artificially divides up. Even talking about countries, for instance, in an economic sense.
Yeah.
It's just not accurate enough.
Well, think about it. If we had a little switch here, and I said when I flick the switch, everything that depends on transnational supply chains will disappear. almost everything in London would disappear. We'd be left in a field with like a few like huts or like kind of like old buildings or like old like sort of kind of I guess what maybe like 16th century or something like that. All right, and it's been a long time since anything was actually not transnational. I mean, I don't know when exactly, right? But there's a kind of like an artificiality to the sort of we do organize each other politically more locally, but in reality, we also have to simultaneously think about the transnational nature of our economic reality. And that's very hard to sort of get those correspondence between those two. And a lot of the kind of like politics of stuff comes from that. I mean, right now, the Brexit debate, this is one of the big things, right? People asserting, it's like, we're going to get independence. It's like, and yet we obviously depend upon, and then there's this whole like angst around the distinction between the political sovereignty and the economic dependence. All right, so then that's whatever, you got to make your mind up about how that works. Cryptocurrency in this context? Okay.
Should we take a 5-minute break?
Sure.
Well, apparently, you know what's crazy? Richard Nixon actually tried to get universal basic income in America, and it went through one of the houses, but not the other one. And apparently, there was a few things that happened. The Democrats demanded that there should be more, it should be higher basic income, and then his advisors came to him and told him that there'd been an experiment in the
Do you have a lean in towards any of the alternative
that had
models?
turned out really bad.
You know, there was that big list of
Apparently they gave
different
some bad
ones.
information.
Are there anything you lean
That's what the guy
towards
said.
that you
But
think
it's interesting to know that
more
Richard Nixon
than another?
came this close to getting.
Forget to ask me in a few years' time. Like, I can, as I said, the sort of scale of the issue is so big that
oh my God, it's like 60
I'm kind of open
Yeah.
to. I don't like to pour scorn on people for believing in different versions of those things. There's reasons people have to believe in all of those things, actually.
Yeah.
But they often have trade-offs built into them.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, I kind of like can get into the mindset of each one of those, and sort of my sort of intuitive tendency is always towards more radical stuff, like ecological existentialists, sort of Marxist-y leaning kind of anarchist type stuff at some intuitive level, but I don't necessarily want to presume that is necessarily the most practical.
Yeah.
It depends on how deep a change you want to make, right? Like it's the greater the change you seek to make, the harder it is. So the deeper down the stack you go.
And surely,
Like
sorry to interrupt.
well, that's basically. I mean, so the question. I mean, that's that. In some ways, there's no right answer because it's like if you want to make a shallow change, you can. It's practical. You can do it, but maybe it's not going to be profound.
Yeah.
You want to make a super deep level change. I mean, it's going to be almost impossible to do. It'll take you decades, and it's subject to a lot of uncertainty. But if you manage to do it, it'll be profound, right? But like, you try and sort of sit around there. A lot of projects I work on actually are not trying to change the entire system. It'd be like we're trying to do some niche thing, improve corporate transparency here or whatever. And it's like some of the most hardline people in the alternative economy movements can be really painful because they can be like, everything must be a gift economy. And it's like, okay, cool. Now what? It's like,
making that happen.
like, all right.
Would you make a distinction between opposition and this solutions and maybe complementary solutions? So, like the difference between maybe a Marxist materialist conception that seeks to overthrow or replace existing models, and systems that seek to exist or create themselves as a complementary model, a complementary system that kind of doesn't seek to sort of.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Well, the complementary model is psychologically appealing you also got to think about what is psychologically. People are people; they're emotional beings. Like, it's not always important to have the most realistic option. Sometimes you want something that's going to give you mental comfort, and that is actually important, right? Like, people need that. So in some ways, like, I've worked on some little projects where I could go in and like dismantle it and tell them why it's bullshit, but I recognize that people need this sort of sense that they're trying to do something. But one of the ways small projects do that historically is around like resilience and diversity principles. So Marxists have always like had this problem about like you demanding large scale breaking of systems, which if it happens would look like it would do a lot, but it makes people often feel disempowered because they're like, we have to get in these huge vast constellations before anything will happen, and like I can't do anything about it right now. And so, like, if you want to create an alternative paradigm, a lot of the, say, permaculture movements, like local currencies, cooperatives, imagine that what they're trying to do is not overthrow a system, but create resilience and diversity in a system. So that their individual contribution will help to add up to a broader change. And psychologically, it's a lot easier for people. Because they believe that they're doing something that's actually going to help, and maybe it will. And certainly at a local scale, it can change something. But they will often get attacked by like hardcore political Marxist types, be like, yes, it's futile.
So I suppose their eyes are on the ultimate prize, right? Rather than the degrees of change that may come before that.
Yeah.
Respect.
So I mean, if you look at it in the left-wing world, like the historical battle between anarchists and Marxists was one way this was phrased, was like, do you know cargo cults? So like cargo cults were in the early 1900s was these groups in Melanesia who would build airplanes on small Pacific islands. They build wooden airplanes under the belief that cargo would drop out of the sky as a result. All right, and there's the anthropology is quite complex, but like in theory, what was happening is that they associated airplanes with cargo, and then thought the act of building the airplanes would make the cargo appear. Okay, it's sort of like a kind of a conceptual error, or maybe not. It's just some kind of like thing, right? And a lot of like Marxists have historically labeled sort of small-scale anarchist things like that. So they kind of say stuff like, you think your little commune or your little community project's going to do anything? Like you're a cargo cult. You're imagining that the mere act of building a hollow form of an alternative economy will make it appear. All right, like building these little like entities is somehow going to make a new world drop from the sky. And whereas the anarchist communities, or however you want to describe them, the sort of small-scale kind of stuff, will say, no, what you're wrong, because what we're doing is we're seeding enough critical mass on the ground that it will like actually at some point kickstart, and they will talk about it as like be the change you want to see in the world. Whereas a lot of like hardcore politicos who have like these big structural critiques never actually change their own behavior. So they'll sit in the university department and be like, oh, here's my like, it won't actually act.
Yeah.
Whereas the anarchist communities do. And there's a kind of like a... Which takes us to crypto, because in a weird way, the crypto space takes certain forms of anarchist principles, albeit without the left-wing history. So should I start in crypto? Are you guys worn out? You ready? Okay, this is just a different present. So I got this here, atoms, molecules, and the two meanings of decentralization. I'll try and flick through this fairly quickly. So let's we ended up that last presentation with the sort of the scale of the problem we face. We're sort of in this alienating economy, and we experience these huge buildings towering over us. I think it's all right. Okay, thank you. And like when you walk out in the street of a city, you're kind of like in this situation here. Like what is the most profound characteristic of the situation, do you think, of like walking out into a city?
Oh, you feel
Chaos.
Huh?
Chaos.
Chaos, okay.
I feel like no matter how many people there are, you're still like anonymous around.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest cultural thing of like modernism or like city-based life. Is this idea that you're constantly surrounded by strangers, people you don't know. This is actually a function of a large-scale specialized economy. The opposite of this is like small hunter-gatherer communities who everyone knows each other and have very strong bonds, and have a very clear and like distinct connection to how they survive and what they produce, but also very small-scale production. Right? The opposite of that is like vast dispersed production of huge networks of people who do not know each other and are highly, highly specialized. Okay, and this is the situation we find ourselves in, right? Which is why people like headlessly walk around trying to find jobs. It's like this idea of like, I gotta find a way to like fit myself into this anonymous network somehow, and I don't know how to do it. I gotta find somewhere that I can get in. You know, this has never been a question in old hunter-gatherer communities of like finding a job. All right, this just doesn't exist. All right, so you're in this vast network, and then you're like experience yourself as this little isolated node in this vast network. And your question is like, how on earth does this situation exist? Like, how on earth do you somehow manage to interact with all these people you don't know? Like, it's like quite amazing actually. Like if you walk into this shop, yeah, this guy like looks pretty friendly and stuff, but like, in some ways it doesn't even matter if he's friendly or not. Like, he could be a real asshole, but you would still be able to like deal with him. You know, in some ways we don't care who the person is that we deal with in this economy. Like when I walked in this building, I barely even like looked at who I was interacting with. Okay, now that would never be the case in old economies. You would very clearly have strong notions of who you were dealing with. All right, and the reason why we don't have to think about this nowadays is that we have all these institutional structures that underpin the trust. Now, as I said, this guy actually looks quite trustworthy to me, but behind him is a whole bunch of state laws, regulatory frameworks, legal systems, policing systems, that if I like ran out of the shop without paying him, there would be a bunch of stuff that would happen to me, and if I bought a product here that screwed me over, I could go and get some kind of recourse. There's a whole bunch of things that are in the background. And we are using a monetary system to engage the monetary system stuff. But there's a whole bunch of these things that are underpinning our ability to interact as strangers. Okay, and this becomes especially apparent when you're in faceless spaces, so the internet, all right, where you don't even see the person you're interacting with. There's all these institutional infrastructures that emerge, such as Amazon, which will actually underpin the interaction between the strangers. Okay, so you can think about at this level here, we've got these like state layers of like, you know, zoning laws and all this kind of stuff, and then these like corporate layers here, like Amazon, that are built on top of that are providing all this interaction. Okay, and this is why I can buy this shoe without having any idea who I'm even buying it from. Okay, I don't even have no idea who they are. And actually, weirdly, in economics, the sort of mainstream economics is this fixation on people as self-interested assholes, basically. This idea that people like screw each other over naturally. Well, the internet is where that is most likely to actually happen. Like economics textbooks were almost written for the internet. All right, because it's the space where you have the least human connection. All you think about might be your personal gain. All right, whereas in many other economic interactions, we're actually thinking about things beyond that. And in the case of the monetary system, we have a similar thing, right? So the money tokens that we use, at least in the, I'm not going to talk about cash right now, also depend upon these institutional underpinnings. Okay, so any form of digital money that we use is underpinned by the banking sector. And essentially we have these accounts at banks who will keep score of our money for us, and then we will send them messages and ask them to edit our accounts, to change the scores of accounts. And they will basically keep track of who has what in terms of money tokens in society. That's what your bank account is. They're sort of keeping an account of the state of current economic distribution or monetary distribution in a society. Now this interacts with the cash system as well, which we're not going to talk about, but basically like this will be the system that you're using when you're engaging in the transfer of money tokens between two people. Okay. And again, the same diagram here, you have the same power dynamic. Now, this is the context you have to see the emergence of the cryptocurrency world in, right? Like, it doesn't make sense outside of that context. One of the historic critiques that come out of, let me just go back to this picture here. One of the historic critiques on libertarian philosophy is this idea that, like, okay, we want people to have private property, and we want them to have contracts between each other, and have these markets that exist. But this cannot exist unless you have people who protect private property rights and underpin contract law. All right, so like you can't have markets without some underpinning structure that will guarantee the property rights and the contracts. And in libertarian theory, this is basically like, it's like the Leviathan in Thomas Hobbes. This idea that this entity will come in and it will arbitrate between strangers. And in modern days, this is like the state, and these various things will actually underpin these interactions. And the problem in libertarian theory is that they say, okay, but this entity that underpins everything is also run by human beings, and all human beings are self-interested. Okay, and this is a problem now because you want these market interactions, but they depend upon humans who are self-interested to underpin all the market interactions, and they run this infrastructure, then they can start to meddle and they can start to like mess stuff up. So it's like the libertarian critique of state. They'll be like, the government doesn't only underpin contracts, it also tries to like, you know, prevent inequality, it tries to like do tax and do all this kind of stuff, right? And they complain about this, and kind of like in libertarian theory, they always basically say the only thing that the state should do is underpin contracts, and that's it, and protect property rights. That's its only role. But it keeps them doing these other things. So they had the whole sort of battle. And when cryptocurrency came out, there's a lot of excitement in libertarian circles because they suddenly recognized that what they designed was a system which you could arbitrate between strangers without there being an overt human party between them. Okay, so this kind of unleashed this imagination that you could replace the human institutional infrastructure that underpins interactions with a robotic infrastructure that underpins it instead. Okay, a non-human infrastructure that will do it. And that's in many ways why so many conservative libertarians got very, very excited and still are very, very excited about cryptocurrency and blockchain technology more generally. At least the original version. Is that kind of like clear enough? Okay. Now, in the original Bitcoin system, and I kind of got involved in Bitcoin around 2012 or something like that, I guess. The original version of it actually had sort of two conceptually separate components. One was this like notion of decentralization, which was like no individual party controls it. Okay. The other was commodity theories of money, a particular idea of what money is. These are actually related. Like the way that cryptocurrency can create commodity-like money is to do with the fact that nobody can control it. All right, because it's not subject to human interaction, which makes the sort of money units start to feel like they're almost like natural objects rather than things subject to change from humans. Okay, so they create this commodity-like money from the fact that the system is decentralized in a certain kind of way. And the basic like notion of what's going on in the crypto. So how many of you guys have used crypto stuff? Like, so you take this like banking sector, which currently essentially has private account databases controlled by an oligopoly of institutions, and you squash all the accounts into a single public account or public database, and then rather than have the sort of private intermediaries change these databases, you get this kind of like decentralized network of techno clerks to change it for you. All right, I don't know if that makes any sense at all. But experientially, it feels kind of similar. You still have like a kind of an account on the system, and you still send orders requesting for your account to be edited or to change. All right, and then somebody else will see something in their account that's emerged. Right, in a normal banking system, this occurs through explicit intermediaries who will literally edit your accounts, and the two people will then see the change. In this system, I'm not going to go into the details of how that actually works, but you'll see the same thing happening. You'll see like the residual amount in your account changes when you send a request into the network. The main difference is that this account is highly public. Everybody can see it, and everybody can see everybody's accounts. And the people who actually do the editing of it are a faceless group of strangers. Okay, that's sort of conceptually the main thing. And conceptually as well, none of the individual members of the network have the ability to unanimously change the database without everybody else getting consensus about it. Now, this is what makes the system feel almost like non-human, all right? Because one of the sort of marks of a kind of a human system is the ability to act on it and have agency and create change, right? But when something feels like godlike or alien, it's like when you do not have the ability to have any impact on it, right? So this is like why in crypto is a lot of the stuff around like trusting in mathematics and these like sort of abstract concepts of like there's some external force to humans that governs it, which is problematic. But
Why do you think that's problematic?
well, because actually in reality that vision's not true. In reality, it is actually controlled by particular people. So there's a distinction between the crypto vision and the reality. So you can critique the vision or like the vision, and then you can critique or like the reality. So those are two conceptually separate things. So in reality, in these systems, if you can get a certain key number of players to decide to change, actually you can change it. But conceptually speaking, you can't change it.
Well, they're just buying loads of public dump and all that, they're changing the price of it.
No, not changing the price, but you can get people. There's a whole. In some ways, these systems work through coordination problems. Like, so in a group like this, let me do a conceptual experiment here. Imagine we all have laptops on the table. Okay, we all got a laptop in front of us, and we are. The task I set you is every single time I do some particular action, I want you to record what happens going down on the cells of an Excel spreadsheet. Okay? And you all got to do it at the same time and try to do it. And I start to, like, I don't know, I throw this at Sam or I do whatever, a bunch of different actions. Okay? And you're all trying to, like, keep track of it. In a room like this, you might be able to do it. After a while, what's going to happen is like you're going to start to diverge. You're going to get different accounts. Like maybe you'll miss something, or like you have a different take on what happens. And then if somebody was to come and say, "Give me a definitive account of what happened," they would have to choose between one of you, and there'd be these like slightly different accounts of what had gone on. Like the way you would normally resolve that is that you'd either appoint an official like minute taker, who's the official record keeper, or else you'd all have to get consensus among each other about what happened, right? By calling out and saying, do we agree Brett did this? All right, and then you'd all make sure you all had the same thing. In a room like this, maybe you could do it. But imagine there's like 10,000 people. No chance in hell they would ever get consensus independently of each other, especially if they had interests, economic interests in not having consensus or trying to like screw systems, right? So this is a lot of how most blockchain systems conceptually are working. There's a whole bunch of people running separate systems, separate Excel spreadsheets as they were. All right, this is like the distributed nature. They're all running separate nodes, but then have a mechanism via which to get consensus about some set of events that's occurred. All right, there's a whole bunch of technicalities about how that consensus is achieved, but once what process you're using, once that's updated and everybody gets consensus, it gets hard to then break that, all right? Especially as you go further along in the history, as people have agreed that something's occurred, and then they agree that something else has occurred, then they agree something else has occurred, and it kind of builds up in this big kind of like layer, and the further down these things go, the harder it gets to get everyone to break this notion of what's happened, okay? And this is what's happening as the crypto systems, is a mechanism for group consensus about a state of affairs. Now, in the case of Bitcoin, the state of affairs people are getting consensus on is who has what tokens. Okay, who who transferred tokens to who at what point and at what order. And that's what the sort of group is recording. All right. Does that kind of like conceptually make sense? There's like a whole bunch of technicalities of how you actually do that, but
I mean, blockchain is actually fallible. Like it's not what it sort of says it's supposed to be. It's fallible. Like it's not actually 100% accurate.
well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by fallible. I mean, like it's
Like,
in its own terms, it's pretty effective at what it does.
is it 100% of that? I'm getting the impression what you're saying is it's not 100% accurate. Like if you actually went back and looked at all the transactions, it's not actually 100% accurate. Is that what you're saying?
No, not necessarily. I mean, like the system has a bunch of rules inbuilt into it.
Yeah.
So, for example, the banking sector. If I want to do a transaction on my card, the banking sector, they have a bunch of rules that they're going to abide by, right?
Yeah.
They say, at this moment in time, we received an order from Brett that arrived at our data center. Timestamp. This time, he makes this request. All right. We will check whether actually recorded in our data center, he has the authorization. So let's say I want to transfer 100 to Sam. They will actually check if my account has that ability. All right, and at what time I'm making that request. So, for example, if I had £100 in my account, recorded in their data center, and then I said, I quickly did, in quick succession, went send 100 to Sam and send 100 to Julian. They would see it coming in. Boom, he's requesting 100. Boom, he's requesting 100 there. He can do that one, but not that one. They reject. System reject. Unless there's some like delay or something, and actually this Julia's order gets it first. Right? They've got a bunch of protocols, and the reason why we trust this is that they've got extremely robust information systems, IT systems, where they don't arbitrarily just make mistakes, unless that they occasionally do, but we tend to trust that they will have these very robust systems. If you're trying to do that same thing without there being paid IT staff and data center operators and all this kind of stuff, you're trying to do that same thing among a random network of strangers, you need a whole bunch of I'm not going to go into it, I've talked too much already, but there's a very set of protocols that they do to create that ability for a set of strangers to do that same thing, right? And they will check what time that comes in, whether the account is allowed to do that, and then once that's been checked, it gets added onto the sort of the system, and then it gets processed and added onto these the chain of history and so on. And as that kind of gets further and further into the past, it gets harder and harder to change. Okay, and that's a very crude top-level description. Maybe just to we can go into talking about the technicalities if you want, but I know Sam has to speak fairly soon, so I don't want to go on too long.
Very much, but I'm not sure if I totally understood what you were sort of saying there as well. In that it did sound a little bit like you were suggesting that process is difficult to achieve, and therefore. What was maybe what you were
Okay, well let me try. This is like building castles in the sky, right? Because there's something this conceptually. Okay, so let's imagine. In the case of the banking sector, people get paid salaries to make sure that when you send requests, that it actually does what they say it's going to do. All right, they get paid. IT professionals get paid salaries to maintain the data centers and maintain all this stuff, right? And if you're trying to now do the same thing, which is we want a system that's going to record digital tokens or units of money, if you want to call it that, but without paying anybody a salary, and without them knowing each other, and without them having any explicit coordination, that's a massive task, right? That's really hard to do. So with the system at the Bitcoin, what they designed was kind of a whole sort of circular incentive mechanism to try and make it work. This is why it's very beautiful and elegant when you look at the actual design of the system, even though it's pretty bad as a monetary system. It's an extremely elegant and beautiful system in many ways. And basically what they said is that they said if you are successful in updating the database, all right? Because in any digital money transaction, the act of the money moving is the act of updating a database, editing a database, right? And seeing a change in an account. So if you are successful in updating the database, we will reward you with a special privilege, which is you'll get to write new money into existence for yourself. Imagine like you had an account, you could just write new tokens into the account for yourself. All right? Like that's your reward if you manage to update the database. But then this creates a new problem, which is, but if it's too easy to update the database, there'll be loads of people doing this, and then the sort of rewards they're giving themselves will be kind of meaningless because it won't be very difficult to do. You know, it's just like, you know, imagine, like conceptually, you need to make it hard to make the update before it feels like the tokens you get are kind of worth it. It's a whole sort of like psychological kind of trick that's going on. All right, and so to create this like this feeling that these tokens were scarce and hard to find, they had to make it deliberately difficult to update the database. So all the proof of work stuff in Bitcoin is about make it really, really hard. Like you collect these transactions and you have them there, you want to update the database, you can see what's happened, but like make it really hard to do it. Like everyone's like, oh, we want to put them on, but we can't. We have to like do all this like arbitrary stuff before we're allowed to update the database. That's what the proof of work hashing algorithms are. They're basically, this is like technical stuff. They basically just say like, you're going to have to run through a maze like thousands of times before you're allowed to update the database. And because the reward for managing to finally do it is you get to write in new money for yourself.
And this is what Bitcoin mining is then?
Yeah, Bitcoin mining is people like, imagine conceptually in a bank, like every time a set of transactions come in, so they're all sitting there, imagine they're all like self-employed clerks or something, and they see all these transactions, people are like asking for money transfers. And then when they come in, they all like grab them and then run outside and then run through some really complex maze and all like running, trying to like compete against each other to like eventually run through it and then run back into the building and then update the database. All right, that's what happens in crypto. There's like, they see all these transactions coming in and then they engage in this big race to try and like run through like a maze. And it's like a bit of a bad analogy, but they sort of process it through a system which there's a certain format you have to get before you can update the database, and it's hard to find this. And so they have to do all this arbitrary work. And this is what creates the feeling that the end result is worth it, right? So it created this sort of kickstarted the psychological belief that these were like object-like tokens you were getting, rather than just random pieces of information you were writing into a system. And this is what they create the notion of digital scarcity. So like if I'm typing something into an Excel spreadsheet, you don't feel there's a scarcity, right? It's quite easy. I can like create it very easily. I'm creating data. But imagine like the keyboard like kept on jumping away from me and it was like really fucking hard to like write stuff into it. I might start to believe that like actually managing to get information onto there, they were almost like objects, so like almost like commodities. Like if they had to like really fucking work to get that on there. And that's what crypto is a bit like. You know, it makes it deliberately difficult. And this is what makes people believe that it's like a digital commodity. This is a very crude description, but that's partly how they got. This is why Bitcoin takes so much energy, because it's also designed that the more people who are trying, it has to increase the difficulty, because otherwise the incentive mechanism breaks down. So, but a lot of that's how the Bitcoin system works. But just to zoom out. Conceptually speaking, the end objective of that process, because there's different processes you can use. The Bitcoin uses this weird running through a maze process to achieve this. But the end objective is how do you get a network of people who are running separate systems to come to consensus and sync up with each other. That's the real like political objective. All right, then you can debate about how you actually do that. And a lot of the new crypto systems don't actually use that proof of work process that Bitcoin uses. But they have the same objective, which is we want a network of people to reach consensus about the state of affairs of something without there being an overt party. So that's important to note, that there's a distinction between the way that you get consensus and the sort of political implications of being able to get consensus without a central party. All right, and a lot of the battles in the crypto space are between the different consensus protocols about how you do it. And Bitcoin's under a lot of attack because that protocol that they use just takes up too much energy. All right, it's just like it's unviable to use that at any scale because it'll just be too destructive ecologically.
So is this the process of proof of work?
Yeah, like running through maze kind of stuff, like making it super hard to like update.
So it's not actually the achieving consensus that's the energy consuming part. It's the
Running the computer.
Yeah. Or once you get through it, all you do sometimes for consensus is that everybody gets the information and spreads it around. So like peer networks you can send stuff around, but the system will only accept a certain format before it allows it in, and to get that format takes a lot of energy.
right.
All right, but once you have that, then everybody can agree. All right, and that's like, so there's conceptually different things that are going on, like the process by which you get consensus, the process by which you get something into the right format to put it onto the database, then propagate that through the network so that everybody agrees that it's there, and then you start adding new stuff onto it. All right, these are different components of the system. And different crypto platforms are using different things for those things. And they were always, like, a lot of the sort of cutting edge stuff is like about how you save energy on that and how you can improve that and so on.
So is the transactional fees, for example, of Bitcoin, is that going to those same miners for doing?
Yeah.
So as well as then having.
If you go on the internet, yeah.
I've actually got a chart on that one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, basically, if you go into blockchain.info, any of these crypto sites, and you can look at the individual blocks. These are pieces that are being added onto the database. You'll see that the first one is always comes from nowhere, right? Because most of the transactions are from one address to another address. But the first transaction in every block is always from nowhere to an address. And that's basically the person who succeeded in updating it has basically written in money for themselves. That's why it comes from nowhere, right? They just basically said, I attribute it to myself. That's their reward. That's their special thing. It's like if you're lucky enough to do it, boom. And that's how they, like, quote unquote, mining tokens. It's the same as like telling bank employees, hey, we're not going to give you a salary, but if you're like, run outside, do this maze, and get back in, you get to put money in your own account for yourself. Write it in. That's what's happening in crypto world. Okay. I mean, Sam, do you stop me if you? I could go into political philosophy of this, but like I don't know if that's useful.
Anyone have any questions?
I had a question. So, like an individual Bitcoin, I'm trying to think of a way I can articulate this properly, but it can be in multiple places at the same time. Then it's not, because I thought that the point about blockchain was that you had certainty, like you had absolute certainty about this particular object. You have certainty about like what it is and where it came from. But if there's a lack of consensus and that consensus needs to be achieved on the register, does that mean that one particular Bitcoin might be in my account and in your account at the same time until the consensus has been achieved? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, look, there's actually a blockchain by itself is just a data structure on a computer where the most quote-unquote blockchain systems, there's no single blockchain. There's like thousands of them that all have consensus. So it superficially looks like there's one. So imagine if, like, let's go back to our Excel spreadsheet example. If we all have an Excel laptop here and we all have exactly the same thing on it, conceptually we could imagine an Excel spreadsheet floating there that's in sync. So it looks like that is the spreadsheet. But actually, the reality is that it's in everybody's system, separately, replicated, okay? And the reality of crypto systems is that the individual big nodes, not most people in the systems aren't doing this, but the big mining nodes and the big full nodes are keeping full accounts of the system. They all have their own version of it. And if you decide, if your account deviates from other people, it won't be recognized as the official version. It won't get any. This is what how forks occur. Like people have different accounts of the same thing, and they become different systems. So the system not only is you got this blockchain, but then you have to get these multiple blockchains that are in consensus with each other. I hope that makes sense. But So in many ways, there is no single place that Bitcoin exists.
Right.
It exists in all these places at once, right, as a record. And then you can only act upon it if everybody else in the network actually agrees that your version is the right version, right? But you notice when these forks happen, so sometimes like the system breaks into two, and suddenly the tokens you had on one system like get replicated. Now you've got them on another system as well because it's part of the original. Let's imagine we've got that Excel spreadsheet system again. Let's say I have 100 tokens recorded on it, and then suddenly somebody disagrees, and half of you break off and say, "Now we've got a new account, and now I have 100 tokens on both, right?" Because we got the system's been like deviated. So like people actually have got rich in crypto sometimes by having like they had Bitcoin, and then suddenly like Bitcoin Cash is created, and now they've also got Bitcoin Cash, and then something else is created, and now they've also got this like. So they just get these like tokens replicated in all these systems. I don't know if that made sense, but like. It's an accounting system, and like most monetary systems.
One question. So, because there's like a limit on how many Bitcoin can be mined, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what's
Theoretically,
the plan for updating the blockchain? What would be the incentive for people to keep updating the blockchain if they're not going to get coins for it?
Oh, that's what the fee systems are about. So. The people who are updating, they don't only get to write new tokens in for themselves, they also get to claim fees from everybody who's trying to do transactions.
Oh, right, okay, so they just give
And actually, this became a big problem like a few years back. I remember I was trying to do like small transactions, and the fees got so high that actually you're paying more in fees than the actual size of the transaction you're doing. Yeah. So, for example, if you try to buy like a beer in some of the London pubs that would accept Bitcoin, you'd be paying more than the beer and the fees, which made it completely unviable for. People were like, why would I pay £7 in fees for like a £6 or £5 transaction? Like it became really problematic because this is how the structure was designed. This is why people are trying to change the protocols and stuff. Okay. Just one thing to throw out here to think about, because this will maybe open up an interesting discussion for you guys. The cryptocurrency is heavily influenced by commodity theories of money, and I would urge you guys to not get captured by these thought systems because they're very dubious. This is the predominant way people think about money, not only in the cryptocurrency circles, but also in a lot of society more generally. So having designed that system, there was a kind of an assumption that it was a monetary system, okay, rather than just a token system. And commodity theories of money basically say that like money is produced prior to a trade. You then transfer it, and it's never destroyed. It's just this like weird perpetual object that just floats around in society. Okay, it's imagined as like a thing that stores value, like almost like a substance. Okay, and you imagine that what's happening when you're engaging in an exchange is that I'm giving you value and you giving me value. All right, this is like the dominant conception in much economics is that exchange is value for value trades. All right, comes from commodity theories of value, commodity theories of money, and then if there's a certain like notion that you're sort of resistant to human intervention or somehow independent in some sense from humans, and lots of people think about money like this and speak about money like this, and it's extremely, extremely dubious. And you should be very, very careful of any kind of thinking about money in this paradigm. The reason why we often do think about money like this is that actually we experience ourselves in an economic system as being on the receiving end of the monetary system. So we have these weird tokens, we move them around. We kind of feel like we have to find them before we can use them. So for a lot of ordinary people, this is the predominant mentality around money. But no monetary system actually works like this. Like this is complete mythology, in my humble opinion. All right, so, but what Bitcoin replicated this thought system in like extreme form, like imagining that like, because what happens in crypto is that they say stuff like, you guys all think money has value, but actually, let me reveal the truth to you. It's actually controlled by the government. It's a giant Ponzi scheme. You think it's got value, but it doesn't have value. Oh, and there's this kind of like weird angst. And it's like, but it should be this commodity-like thing. And now here we're going to give you this commodity-like thing. And this is the sort of way it works. but it's based on a completely kind of like sort of scaremongering false vision of what money has always been, or like what it should be. And just to maybe end on this, there's a lot of fixation upon natural law concepts in the crypto world, which is this idea that fallible human institutions are the cause of all our problems. All right, and that how you deal with that is by moving to non-human systems. All right, and a lot of thinking, like religious thinking, has this. Right, you imagine a external entity that sets rules outside of yourself, like a god. Like if you look at like sort of morality and religious morality, like the source of morality exists outside of society and it's sort of imported in, and then how you are a moral person is if you act in accordance with the rules set by the external force. Okay, and a lot of sort of natural law concepts have this notion of natural order and natural stuff that will emerge if you act in accordance with the natural rules. And so this is why actually cryptocurrency, it has this like feeling, because they created a system which the tokens start to feel like they're outside of human control, and so that it looms like a kind of non-human system. This is also why it's become associated with fascism or neo-fascism, because a lot of that same thinking you find in a lot of the anti-feminist movements, and a lot of the kind of like, there's a natural hierarchy of races, natural hierarchies of genders, and spontaneous inequality that naturally occurs, and this idea that there shouldn't be human institutions getting together to decide to make changes to these systems, and that the source of problems in society is from collective action, where people get together and meddle and stuff. So a lot of the sort of more hardline right-wing versions of this really fixate on this idea that there's like, do not mess with the natural order. All right, and this is where a lot of the sort of more left-leaning crypto stuff diverges from the Bitcoin community, because the sort of more cooperative left-wing anarchist versions are now saying, screw that weird like robotic vision. We're going to create decentralized systems. We're going to create this sort of idea of like consensus-based models, but we're not going to have this like inhuman feel to it, where it exists outside of yourself. Like we got to design systems where we can have like real like governance structures and stuff in it.
But isn't cryptocurrency libertarian, which is like a libertarian idea, many would say? It's like an inherently right-wing ideology?
It like originally was, yeah.
Like less incoherent, less incoherent.
Yeah, but in an incoherent way. Like, there's a lot of, yeah. I don't know how deep to go into this, but like, libertarian philosophy is really, there's got some deep flaws in it, and it's replicated in crypto a lot. Like, the main flaws you find in libertarian philosophy is the idea that you can somehow have all this stuff, these things that we have around us, and yet still be independent. And yet everything around us is predicated on interdependence. Like, this cannot exist. This literally cannot exist without hundreds of thousands of other people building it and like all that kind of stuff, right? So the notion that you could actually exist as some kind of autonomous, heroic individual and yet still have access to this is incoherent, right? Like, because what a pure autonomous individual is like a sort of mountain man living on the land, right? Like, with a very small amount of stuff, but pure autonomy. So what libertarianism has a huge problem with, not that it doesn't have good aspirations in certain things, is it often becomes a kind of cloaked way of saying, I want to have power over other people without them having any power over me. This is what they call like vulgar libertarianism. It's like, I want material goods and power, but I don't want any further claims upon myself, right? Which is where it diverges with left-wing anarchism, who says, we accept this heavy level of interdependence, and we're prepared to maybe like let go of things because we recognize that what we are is actually truly interdependent beings. And this is why like libertarianism often like falls apart, like in sort of like a kind of a conceptual philosophical sense, is that this refusal to accept the reality of economic systems, which is like, you're not independent.
Just to go back to the previous point you made around commodity theories of money.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I totally understood what you were saying. Was it mainly about saying that effectively normal money does have value? Is that...
So, like, I mean, commodity theories of money are like, so the opposite of commodity theories of money are credit theories of money, which are by far a lot more accurate. So, the basic idea is like the commodity theories seek to ignore economic networks. So they say the reason that we use money is that we individually, as a rational being, see that it has value. All right, and then so I say, oh, here's this like object-like thing that has value, and I'm going to use it to induce you to give me another thing. All right, so there's this idea of like sort of these weird quasi-autonomous individuals who like make a decision to use money. All right, they say, oh, we all, I can see this is valuable. Will you give me something for it? Right? It's based on these really like weird notions. Whereas like what's actually happening in economies is that people cannot survive by themselves. They're in interdependent networks. All right, so the money system does not give a shit whether you think it's valuable or not. It's irrelevant what you think about the money system. The British pound does not care whether you think it's valuable or not. It's got nothing to do with it. All right. The reason why you have to use the British pound is that you cannot survive without it, because it is the way that you mediate between your personal stuff that you're doing and everybody else that you depend upon. So the notion in commodity theories of money was somehow that like you're just this weird like individual who's like somehow autonomous. You find this valuable object and then you use it to find some other person. Whereas credit theories are all about like recognizing the interdependence, and they say the actual tokens do not need independent value. They don't require their own sort of existence. They're held in play, much like the center point of a spider's web is held in play by all the strands. All right, so imagine like the spider's web coming in, like that center point doesn't hover by itself. It's held there by all the strands. Whereas commodity theories, like they remove all the strands and they just imagine this weird floating object that quote unquote stores value. All right, this is why this pervades all our language around money. It pervades everything. It's why people refer to like money systems as value transfer systems. I mean, it's completely incoherent when you start to like go into it. But it's a kind of like a thing that happens to people who don't recognize the networks that they find themselves in. So you start to fetishize the money as somehow being like a weird floating thing that has value in itself. But real money systems they derive their value from other people. Whereas commodity theories want to say that it has its own value, right? So, and in our actual monetary systems, what's happening is you got like multiple layers of tokens being pushed into the system that people then use to do trades between themselves, and they go out of the system. So they get issued, and they issued and taken out. Yeah. Anyway, some of the most exciting crypto projects right now are moving away from all this. I'm not going to go do this here, but are moving away from the commodity theories, and they're actively recognizing the interdependent network nature of real economies, right? And so some of the most interesting ones now are these kind of based on credit theories, things like this, Holochain, Sokobo trust lines. There's a bunch of these different groups which actually say we need to build sort of lines of trust between people and recognize the kind of the human-created nature of money, rather than trying to pretend that it's some kind of weird commodity-like object, which is what Bitcoin does. So anyway, I'm gonna end there, Sam, because I've been talking for fucking ages now.
Well, thank you very much.